Picture a stadium in the mid-1970s. The house lights go down. The crowd is just absolutely roaring.
Right, setting the scene.
Yeah, and behind the drum kit, a massive 40-foot Confederate battle flag unfurls. I mean, if you were standing in that audience looking at that stage, you probably think you know exactly what this band stands for.
Oh, absolutely. You expect these reactionary, conservative, regional anthems.
Exactly. But then the lead vocalist steps up to the microphone, and the words coming out of his mouth are actually some of the most socially progressive working-class populism in rock history.
It's a huge contradiction.
It really is. I mean, how does a band performing under symbol of the Confederacy secretly write lyrics condemning racism, demanding strict gun control, and calling out corporate greed?
It's the ultimate paradox.
You're listening to Deep Cuts and Deep Thinking.
Glad to be here for this one.
So today, we are taking you on a mission. We have this massive stack of historical, musicological studies and research reports right here on the table between us. Our goal for you in this deep dive is to basically strip away all those decades of corporate branding and cultural mythology that have completely surrounded Lynyrd Skynyrd.
Because there is a lot of it.
We really want to reveal the true, complex, lyrical subversions of a band that is, way too often dismissed as just this regional caricature.
It really is one of the most fascinating bait and switch stories in American music history. I mean, we have this profound disconnect between the aggressive visual imagery the band projected and the actual nuanced substance of the art they were creating.
Right.
And to understand how that massive gap happened, we really have to look closely at the machinery of the 1970s music industry and the environment that forged this band.
The irony is, if MCA Records was trying to sell them as these reactionary outlaws, it feels like nobody at the label actually bothered to read Ronnie Van Zant's lyric sheet. But before we get to those lyrics, we really have to explain where that divisive visual imagery actually came from. Because if they were writing this progressive, thoughtful music, it completely defies logic that they would organically choose a 40-foot Confederate flag as their banner.
Well, the historical record shows that they didn't organically choose it. That flag was not the band's original ideological statement at all.
It wasn't.
No, it was essentially a commercial marketing gimmick. It was imposed from the top down by MCA Records and their early management, specifically a man named Alan Walden, right around 1973 and 1974.
It is wild to think about a record label literally assigning an identity of that magnitude to a band.
It was purely a business decision.
I mean, when I try to think of a modern equivalent for you listing, it's like a major label today taking a young, struggling indie folk artist and forcing them into this highly controversial, manufactured punk aesthetic just to generate shock value and sell records.
That is a highly accurate comparison.
Only in this case, the chosen symbol carried immense, real-world historical trauma. Did they not realize their actual music was telling a completely different story?
You have to remember where these guys came from. When MCA signed them, the label was searching for a specific, marketable angle.
Right.
The Allman Brothers had already broken through, but the label wanted something grittier, They explicitly wanted to sell these Southern outlaw tropes to Northern and international markets who were fascinated by that caricature.
Because they were young and broke.
Right. Exactly. This was a band of working-class kids from Westside Jacksonville, Florida. They had grown up in severe poverty. For years, they rehearsed in this sweltering, unair-conditioned cabin down in Green Cove Springs that they literally called the Hell House.
Oh, Hell House.
Yeah, the heat was blistering, there were snakes outside, and they played for hours a day just trying to escape their economic reality. So they were completely desperate for a record deal.
So when you're starving in a hot cabin, and a major label executive from out of town says, "We are going to market you as wild rebel renegades to sell millions of records in New York and London," you're probably not going to push back very hard on the stage props.
Precisely. And Gary Rossington, their lead guitar player, he actually addressed this very point later in his life.
What do you say?
He admitted in multiple interviews that they were incredibly young, they were politically naive, and they were largely unaware of how deeply painful that symbol was for Black Americans.
That's a huge blind spot.
It was. From their insular perspective in that Jacksonville cabin, they just saw it as a prop that the label gave them to represent the geographical region they were from.
So just a massive failure of empathy and awareness born out of a very narrow, localized worldview.
Exactly. But the tragedy, as we are about to explore, is that the music they were writing under that imposed corporate flag was communicating something entirely different.
And that gap between the marketing and the message is where we really need to dig in today.
Yep.
So let's look at the actual lyrics that completely defied the traditional Southern conservative stereotypes that were being projected onto them.
Let's do it.
Because the most jarring example in the research stack has to be their stance on firearms, which is something nobody associates with the Lynyrd Skynyrd brand.
No, not at all. But if you listen to their 1975 album, Nothing Fancy, there is a track called Saturday Night Special.
Oh, yeah.
And musicological studies routinely highlight this as one of the most aggressive anti-handgun songs in the history of rock and roll.
Which is a completely unexpected stance for a band marketed to a conservative Southern rock fan base.
It really is.
Wait, let me push back slightly on behalf of the listener here. Could this just be like a gritty song describing street crime rather than an actual political stance?
It's a fair question, but no. The lyrics leave almost zero room for interpretation. Van Zant tells a story about a poker game that escalates into fatal violence simply because a cheap handgun was in the room.
Right.
And then he explicitly calls for these weapons to be thrown to the bottom of the sea.
Wow. literally to the bottom of the sea.
He takes it even further than that. The lead vocalist literally sings that handguns ain't no good for nothing else but killing a man.
That is unambiguous.
And historically, this was an unequivocal political plea. Van Zant was directly and intentionally challenging the conservative gun rights dogma that was widely assumed of the band's own fan base.
But here is where the mechanics of the music become so fascinating to me. Because when you hear Saturday Night Special, you are not hearing a soft acoustic protest song.
No, not at all.
You are hearing a heavy driving rock anthem. So how did the band manage to sneak such a progressive political message past an audience that was literally waving Confederate flags?
That is where the musical arrangement acts as a brilliant disguise. The track is built on this incredibly heavy, driving bass line and what musicologists call aggressive contrapuntal layers in the guitars.
For the listeners who might not be musicians, contrapuntal basically means you have multiple independent melodies playing at the exact same time rather than just strumming a single chord. It creates this incredibly dense, chaotic wall of sound, right?
Precisely. You have the lead guitar weaving one complex pattern, a second guitar playing a counter melody, and a relentless rhythm section underneath it all.
It's just a wall of aggression.
Yeah, and the listener is so overwhelmed by this aggressive, gritty sonic texture that they get swept up in the visceral energy of the song. They are banging their heads to the rhythm, completely missing the fact that the singer is literally delivering a thesis statement on throwing firearms into the ocean.
The sonic aggression of the music effectively cloaks the progressive vulnerability of the lyrics. It's brilliant musical misdirection.
It really is a magic trick.
But, you know, Saturday Night Special is still somewhat of a deep cut compared to their massive radio anthems. I feel like the ultimate test of this paradox, this massive gap between the brand and the message, has to be applied to their absolute biggest hit.
You mean Sweet Home Alabama?
Exactly, Sweet Home Alabama. I mean, it reached number 8 on the Billboard charts. It's the definitive Southern anthem. And for decades, it has been casually dismissed by critics as this reactionary, segregationist manifesto.
Which is one of the most pervasive misunderstandings in American pop culture.
Yeah.
When you actually deconstruct the recording of Sweet Home Alabama, that assumption completely disintegrates. The song is highly complex, and it operates on multiple levels of irony and subversion.
I have to say, when I listened to the isolated vocal tracks on this song during my research, the part that absolutely blew my mind wasn't Van Zant's lead vocal, but what the backing singers were doing.
Yes, the second verse.
Right, the second verse. Van Zant sings, "In Birmingham, they love the governor." He is referring to the segregationist governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who famously stood in the schoolhouse door in 1963 to block racial integration.
And people usually stop at that lyric and just assume the band is supporting Wallace.
Exactly. But if you listen closely, right after he says that line, the backing vocals clearly and loudly chant, "Boo, boo."
They explicitly boo the segregationist governor on their own track.
It's wild.
And Van Zant later confirmed to the press that the lyric was a sarcastic jab, stating firmly that he did not agree with Wallace's racist policies.
So the meaning is literally the opposite of what people think.
Entirely. And if we look at the broader political reality of the era, their actions off stage matched that sentiment perfectly.
How so?
During the 1976 presidential election, Ronnie Van Zant and the band actively campaigned for Democratic candidate Jimmy Carter, raising money for his run.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, Carter represented the New South, which was a political movement specifically trying to move past the painful, segregated legacy of politicians like George Wallace.
And the subversion isn't just in the political lyrics, right? It is baked deeply into the musical homage of the song itself. I mean, the entire final verse is dedicated to a group of musicians in Muscle Shoals, Alabama.
Ah, yes, the Swampers.
The Swampers. And what makes that homage so vital is understanding how Muscle Shoals operated in the 1960s and 70s. This was an integrated group of studio musicians operating in the Deep South.
Right.
They were recording with countless elite black soul and R&B artists, from Aretha Franklin to Wilson Pickett. By dedicating the climax of their biggest hit to the Swampers, Van Zant is explicitly celebrating the cross-racial, integrated roots of Southern music.
It's a huge statement. And to elevate that specific celebration, the band made a highly intentional casting choice for the recording studio.
Who did they bring in?
The backing vocals on Sweet Home Alabama were performed by Mary Clayton and Clyde King.
Oh, wow.
Yes, these were two phenomenal, legendary black gospel and soul singers. The band deliberately brought their voices in to serve as the moral conscience of the track.
It functions exactly like a Trojan horse. You have this incredibly catchy 3-chord, radio-friendly anthem. It is entirely driven by Ed King's iconic Stratocaster riff on the lead guitar.
Everyone knows that riff.
Yeah, and that riff is so joyful and infectious that it bypasses the brain's critical filter entirely. People in the 1970s are tapping their feet, they're rolling down their windows, they're buying the record because of the Southern Outlaw marketing.
Right, they're buying into the brand.
And meanwhile, the band has secretly smuggled a sharp rejection of racist politicians and a beautiful celebration of black musical heritage right onto mainstream middle American radio.
It's a Trojan horse of progressive populism wrapped flawlessly in a Southern rock groove. It is a masterful piece of songwriting because it works on the surface as a regional party anthem, but the deeper you dig, the more it reveals its true political and social alignment.
But you know, that brings up a massive historical contradiction that we really have to address here.
Okay, what's that?
If Ronnie Van Zant was actually a progressive populist who revered integrated music, it makes his famous feud with Neil Young incredibly confusing.
Ah, the famous feud.
Right. I mean, in the opening verse of Sweet Home Alabama, Van Zant explicitly calls out the rock legend by name. He sings, "I hope Neil Young will remember, a Southern man don't need him around anyhow."
He definitely calls him out.
So if they were on similar political wavelengths regarding civil rights and progressive values, why were they publicly attacking each other?
Well, this is where we uncover another incredible layer of the mythology that the industry created.
The biggest, most talked about musical feud of the 1970s was entirely a fiction created by journalists.
The historical evidence points directly to that conclusion. It was a narrative completely manufactured and amplified by the music press because, well, controversy sells magazines.
So what was the actual dynamic between them?
The reality is that Ronnie Van Zant held immense respect for Neil Young as an artist and a songwriter. But Van Zant felt that Neil Young's songs, specifically the tracks Southern Man and Alabama, were unfair, broad-brush generalizations.
Okay, I can see that.
Young's lyrics essentially indicted the entire Southern region, and Van Zant felt that Young was condemning every struggling, working-class Southerner for the sins of the wealthy institutional racists who actually held power.
Well, that makes so much sense. It is exactly like a modern hip-hop rap battle.
How so?
Well, Neil Young essentially dropped a diss track aimed at the entire geographical South, painting everyone with the same brush. And Van Zant used Sweet Home Alabama as the response track to defend the working class people who has nothing to do with those racist policies.
That's a great way to look at it.
But just like in hip-hop, a response track doesn't always equal genuine hatred. Often, it is just two heavyweights sparring for the love of the game, challenging each other's lyrical perspectives.
And the proof of their mutual admiration was hiding in plain sight the entire time.
Where was it?
Ronnie Van Zant proudly and frequently wore a Neil Young Tonight's the Night t-shirt on stage during their concerts.
He wore the guy's merch while supposedly feuding with him.
Exactly. That is a dark, complex album, and within that sheet was a clear signal to anyone paying attention that Van Zant was a genuine fan of Young's deep cuts. He even chose to wear that exact Neil Young shirt prominently on the front cover of the band's 1977 album, Street Survivors.
Wow. You simply do not put another artist's merchandise on your own album cover if you harbor genuine hatred for them. That detail changes the entire context of the song. Did Neil Young ever publicly respond to this dynamic?
He absolutely did, and his retrospective take on the situation is incredibly telling. In his 2012 autobiography, titled Waging Heavy Peace, Neil Young offered a deeply honest reflection on the whole supposed feud.
What did he write?
He wrote that looking back on it, his own song Alabama was, and I am quoting his book directly here, accusatory and condescending, not fully thought out.
That's a huge admission.
It is. Young explicitly stated that he richly deserved the lyrical shot that Lynyrd Skynyrd took at him in Sweet Home Alabama.
It is genuinely beautiful that the press spent years trying to start a cultural war, and behind the scenes, these two brilliant songwriters are just quietly respecting each other's craft and acknowledging their own blind spots.
They shared a profound creative connection. In fact, Neil Young actually offered one of his unreleased songs titled Powderfinger for Lynyrd Skynyrd to record.
Wait, Neil Young wrote a song for them to play?
Yes! The band loved the track and was actively planning to take it into the studio, but tragically, that collaboration never came to pass because of the devastating October 20th, 1977 plane crash.
Which took the lives of Ronnie Van Zant, Steve Gaines, Cassie Gaines, and several others in their crew.
Yes. It abruptly ended everything.
Which ended the trajectory of a band that was operating on such an incredibly high, nuanced level, both musically and lyrically. I mean, their original authentic run was cut incredibly short, just as they were hitting their absolute creative peak.
It was a monumental loss for American music. And, that tragic end really brings us to the core of why this deep dive matters so much for you, the listener, today.
How so?
Because this entire story operates as a masterclass in media literacy.
Because it forces us to confront how easily we accept surface-level packaging.
Precisely. It challenges you to look past the corporate label's cynical marketing strategies. It challenges you to look past the provocative, sometimes deeply painful visual branding, and past the sensationalized, manufactured media narratives about feuds.
Right.
When you strip all of that artificial noise away and actually focus on the art itself, when you take the time to analyze the complex contrapuntal layers of the lead guitars, the driving bass guitar rhythms, and the raw, progressive poetry of Ronnie Van Zant's lyrics, you discover a completely different reality than the one you were sold.
It is a stark reminder that the packaging is rarely the whole product. Sometimes the most subversive ideas are hiding inside the most commercial wrappers.
And that leads to one final, deeply fascinating historical irony that we have to unpack before we finish.
Well, let's hear it.
Following that devastating 1977 plane crash, the surviving members of the band eventually reunited years later. But this reunion led to a massive, protracted legal battle among the survivors and the widows of the deceased members over the rights to use the band's name.
So we got tied up in court.
Yes. Ultimately, a federal judge had to step in, resulting in a 1988 federal consent order.
Now, for those who might not know, a consent order is essentially a legally binding agreement codified by a judge to resolve a dispute. How did this specific legal document affect the band's legacy?
This specific 1988 consent order essentially turned the name Lynyrd Skynyrd into a legally protected, highly regulated corporate trademark.
A trademark?
Yes. The legal document dictated exact parameters, such as requiring a specific number of pre-crash members, like Gary Rossington, to be present on stage for the group to legally tour under the name.
Wow.
It laid out strict rules for how revenues were to be shared. It transformed a living, breathing artistic collective into a franchised operation, not unlike a corporate chain.
So this organic band of working-class kids who formed their complex, progressive, blue-collar identities sweating it out in the Florida cabin was permanently transformed into a rigid legal entity.
Yes. And the profound irony is that this legal framework effectively ensured the survival of the marketed brand. You know, the 40-foot Confederate flags, the manufactured Southern outlaw image that MCA Records created, while the actual subversive soul of the music was left in the past.
That is incredible.
The federal law protected the corporate trademark, ensuring that the visual aesthetic might forever outlive the nuanced progressive reality of Ronnie Van Zant's original songwriting. Today, the trademark tours the world, but the complex, anti-racist, pro-gun control soul of the 1970s band is a piece of history you have to actively dig through the archives to find.
That is a haunting thought to walk away with. A vital subversive voice forever trapped inside a permanent corporate trademark. It proves just how powerful, and sometimes how permanent, a manufactured narrative can be if we don't take the time to listen to the actual music.
It really does.
If you like this episode, please support the show by liking and subscribing.